Good morning. Thanks for joining us on this Friday. I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. We begin with breaking news, of course, as war unfolds in Ukraine this morning. Explosions and sirens heard in and around Kyiv. Overnight, Ukraine's defense ministry saying Russian forces have arrived in the capital, and they are calling on residents to make Molotov cocktails and prepare to fight. U.S. officials say Russia has launched more than 160 missiles since strikes began Wednesday night, targeting major Ukrainian cities from 3 sides of the country. Ukraine says Russians have also seized control of the area around the damaged, decommissioned Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Ukraine's president says so far at least 137 people have been killed, hundreds more injured. Residents are now leaving the country by the thousands and placing the blame on Russian President Vladimir Putin.
To see this happening to the country is just devastating. I just can't believe someone could be so evil.
As for the global response, President Biden announced more sanctions meant to cripple the Russian economy. He also issued orders sending 7,000 more troops closer to Ukraine.
Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
Across the U.S., a massive show of support for the people of Ukraine as thousands gather at rallies from coast to coast and even across Russia. We are seeing protests against the invasion and against President Putin. We have a team standing by to cover it all. Let's get right to NBC News correspondent Cal Perry, who is in western Ukraine. Cal, looks like Russian forces are reaching the capital. What can you tell us about what's happening throughout the country right now, including where you are in Lviv?
Yeah, in the capital, dramatic scenes unfolding as Russian troops, according to the Ukrainian government, are moving in from the north and from the east. It seems clear at this point they have breached some of those outer neighborhoods. There is reports of fierce fighting taking place there as well as in other places across the country. Where I am here, about 350 miles from Kyiv, we are starting to see really an influx of folks who have been displaced from the fighting. The UN says at least 100,000 people have already been displaced. You can count on those numbers rising. Some folks moving towards Poland while soldiers move in the other directions. Bus stations, train stations really starting to fill up. We continue to see a run on cash, people trying to get cash out of ATMs, trying to get to the border. It is becoming more and more difficult to do so. The wait at the Polish border right now, last time we checked, was about 24 hours. So it is becoming an increasingly difficult situation here.
Cal, we're seeing a full military mobilization in Ukraine. Weapons have been handed out to civilians. Officials are encouraging people to even make Molotov cocktails to fight back. What is the resistance like there? What do we expect to see happen as these troops and Russian tanks move into these big city centers?
Yeah, you know, the Ukrainian news this morning was saying that 16,000 assault rifles, according to the government, had been handed out just in the city of Kyiv. We've heard the government say that anyone who is able-bodied, and any able-bodied male, should join the fight, and that all you have to do if you want to join the fight is bring your passport, some form of ID, and in you will go. It is clear that they are trying to increase the number of people engaging with Russian forces as they move around. Look, the Ukrainian army at times, we know, is stopping the Russian advancement, but we just don't have a full picture really on what's happening. And we do know, because we're looking at the video, that Russian troops continue to advance on the capital. So the Ukrainian government doing everything they can to protect the Ukrainian capital, but it is not looking good as Russian forces start to encircle that city.
And Cal, we heard from Ukraine's President Zelenskyy overnight. He says his country has been left alone to defend itself. He says the international community is not doing enough. What is Ukraine asking for right now?
Harder sanctions. They want those SWIFT transactions to be halted. There is a question here amongst the government. We've heard the president sort of say this. They want more. They want more from NATO countries. Now, look, Ukraine is not a NATO nation, so it is not applicable to Article 5, where those other countries would have to step in. But neighboring countries are starting to feel the pressure. They're starting to feel what is happening here because, of course, you're going to have that influx of refugees. So the government here wants more to be done. They want those sanctions to be harder and tougher. They want anything to take place because, of course, these are drastic scenes. I mean, it's sort of unbelievable to watch these Russian forces move in on a European capital, and the Ukrainian government is asking anybody to do anything they can at this point.
Cal Perry in Lviv, Ukraine. Cal, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, Terrell Jermaine-Starr, is also in Kyiv this morning. Terrell, thank you for being with us. As our viewers can see, you're in a car right now driving. You, of course, were not one of the people that was in those lines of traffic we saw yesterday leaving the city. You are still there. I understand, I believe that you're headed with your friend to sign up to fight. Please tell me exactly what you're seeing right now, what overnight has been like for you, what's happening in Kyiv right now, and do you feel safe?
Well, thank you very much for having me on. And right now, it's a very eerie scene. I've been in the Kyiv for going on more than a decade, and it is eerily empty right now. People are right now trying to figure out how to maintain their safety as exodus of people who are leaving Kyiv. Every day, you see people with baggage, roller baggage, going, stuffing their belongings in a car, heading out to the safest place possible outside of the city. Just about a 15-minute walk from where I live, I captured some video of a building that was hit by what I believe was debris from an interceptor that took in a cruise missile or some type of damage. And so I'm not sure about the number of fatalities there. It was just 15 minutes walk from where I am. I'm currently with my friend Andre, who is going to a recruitment center to sign up to fight. He sent his family to Poland. He decided to stay behind and fight for his country. We're heading to that recruitment center right now. He will be one of the many citizens who will be grabbing a gun and volunteering to support the armed forces here.
Terrell, why is it so important for you to stay and fight?
I am a journalist, and my job is to report. This is my first time covering a war. I'm learning it as I go. It's important for people like myself who are regional studies experts to be here and capture what's happening here in Ukraine. And I'm also here, in addition to being a journalist, many of these people, I can't call them friends, they're deeper than that, including Andre. And so I think it's as responsible for me as possible to capture the human toll of what's Putin's aggression is and what that looks like. And this is an example right now of somebody who I dearly love and care for going to a recruitment center to grab a gun and risk his life.
Yeah, absolutely. Terrell, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, you said your friend's name is Andre, who's also welcome to speak with us here. I mean, we have been hearing from citizens in Kyiv who...
Do you hear her?
You can focus on driving, but just feel free to answer this question as well. I mean, we've been hearing from so many citizens in Kyiv who are basically saying, look, we knew this was a threat. We didn't know if it would come to this. We didn't really believe this would be happening actually within the city. We also are hearing things like citizens being encouraged to make Molotov cocktails. I mean, if you really think about the potential for what's coming and your decision right now to drive, to sign up, to fight, I mean, what are you thinking could happen over the next day or so? How are you feeling about it? Do you feel that the Ukrainian people, citizens who are going to pick up a gun, are prepared?
She's asking if you feel like you're ready to fight, and were you really expecting all of this to happen? You can speak.
Well, I'm not looking forward to it, it's definitely, but this is what I say. If we all do within our capabilities, within our limits, everything for the country we dearly love, then we're gonna have victory. We're gonna win. And this is my position, and I'm not lying to myself doing this. I'm not looking forward to this. I don't think I'm emotionally ready to fight, and I'm ready to kill someone. No, but if it comes to that, this is what I have to do. I will certainly do that.
Terrell, do you feel like what Andre just said there, is that the feeling among most people you know there in Ukraine?
Absolutely, yeah. The definite feeling is that, the language that I hear Ukrainians using is that we will not be slaves. You will not turn us into another Russia. You will not make us subjected to you. And so everybody is saying, they're older people, 80 years old, with bad knees. If they have a finger and they can pull a trigger, they'll pull it. When the government said, hey, be ready to throw Molotov cocktails, there will be people with Molotov cocktails ready to fight. If war breaks out in this city, this will be Taliban 2.0. And the Ukrainian forces have been fighting very valiantly, and so these citizens are definitely ready to take up arms, and there are people waiting to get behind. So this is not going to be a cakewalk. They're not going to welcome the Russians with cookies and milk. I'll tell you that.
Terrell Jermaine Starr, we thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We thank Andre as well for talking with us. We're thinking of both of you, and we'll try and check in with you throughout this process. Stay safe.
Absolutely. And Andre, we're thinking of your family. I hope they made it to Poland safely.
Thank you about your family.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Now, earlier this morning, the eastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv came under attack.
NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley was live on the air with our colleagues at MSNBC at that moment. Take a look.
I was surprised because we've always heard a low rumbling from outside the city. We did know that there was fighting on the outskirts of the city around the ring road, but now, again, that has changed. A new development here, moving into the city. We'd have to go out. Well, we might not go out and check, but it looks as though we're still seeing some traffic circulating. But this was the closest we've heard so far in the last more than 24 hours of bombardment around Kharkiv. Again, as I said, it's never been so close to the center of the city. Right. I don't know if you can hear those sirens wailing in the background. So clearly there's emergency services heading to the scene. And again, we did hear some car alarms going off, which means there must have been a concussion from the blast, which is close enough. Up until now, we've never seen windows shaking or walls shaking or ground shaking. It's always just been sounds, low rumbles, again, from the distance. This is the first time we're starting to hear that. And it sounds as though some bombardment piercing closer into the center. There we go again.
Yeah.
And you hear this car alarms. That might be anti-aircraft fire. Again, we are not hearing, as we did in Kyiv, I believe that's anti-aircraft fire. We are not hearing the sirens wailing for the city. We're not hearing the broadcasting system coming on yet. That is next. That's what happened in Kyiv. Car alarms there. You can hear that, Eamon. This is a new development in this city. This was a relatively peaceful sort of eye of the storm here. We had heard from U.S. intelligence that there was fierce fighting on the outskirts of the city. But again, this is a new development.
Matt did move to a safer location shortly after that. Matt Bradley reporting a little earlier on MSNBC Reports.
Let's now head over to Moscow, where we're joined by NBC News reporter Matt Bodner. Matt, thanks for joining us. So let's talk through some of this from Russia's side. This morning, Britain's defense secretary told the BBC that Russia, quote, failed on day one to take any of its objectives. And he also says 450 Russian personnel have died so far. That's citing UK intelligence. We've not been able to verify that. But have the Russians said anything about casualties, about whatever these objectives were? And how confident is Moscow in capturing the capital city of Kyiv? Is that still what we think is the objective as we continue to watch this unfold?
Thank you, Savannah. Well, let's start with Moscow's objective. It is certainly clear at this point that their objective is Kyiv. They are telegraphing loud and clear that they are in Ukraine to essentially conduct regime change. They want to. They're kind of trumpeting this liberationist narrative, talking about a fascist government in Kyiv that needs to be demilitarized. So, just kind of the same way they're not calling a war, they're not calling it regime change. It's just it's clearly inferable from what they're doing and the way they talk about it. Meanwhile, as they talk about this, they are also claiming that they're running a massively successful campaign. Yesterday, basically directly contrary to everything we're hearing from the Ukrainians, from this British intelligence assessment that you just mentioned, they say that they achieved all of their day one goals. Now, we don't really know what those are. They threw out a pretty high number of Ukrainian military infrastructure facilities disabled yesterday, but they didn't really elaborate too much. They are claiming things such as Ukrainian units are surrendering and throwing down arms in very large numbers, that they're avoiding population centers, that they're not harming civilians. And so they're kind of painting this very neat picture of essentially the most perfect military operation ever run, but they are not admitting any casualties. They haven't brought this up at all. That, of course, also strains credulity. So we're just kind of in this fog of war scenario right now with these statements.
Now, Matt, the Kremlin says that President Putin is expected to meet with his Security Council today to impose retaliatory sanctions on the West. Do we know what kind of measures Russia is planning, how long that operation is going to last, and any reaction or concern from the West?
So we have very sort of little idea what they might do. We just keep hearing that they continue to promise they continue to promise some kind of massive retaliatory sanctions. We've heard at various stages from various officials from the Kremlin on down that Russia's response may not necessarily be symmetrical. So they're going to start looking at things that they could maybe do that would hurt the West. They may not be a direct response to, for example, some of the banking sanctions we've seen. These could be things related to energy or natural resources.
Matt, quickly before I let you go, I have to ask you about some of these really stark images we've seen. Protesters in Russia coming out to city centers. And then in the last 24 hours, we've seen a crackdown on these anti-war protesters in Russia. Talk to us about what's going on there and what the general level of support is like among the population for this invasion.
It doesn't seem to be a necessarily popular move. It certainly doesn't feel like 2014 did, when Crimea was annexed, where you would see kind of pro-government demonstrations everywhere. So we saw, of course, some basically initial anti-war protests breaking out in cities across the country last night. They were not the largest protests we've ever seen, but it's important to note, we're not seeing pro-government protests, but they are concerned enough that you now have government propagandists like the head of Russia Today writing things on Twitter like, I want to address all of you Russians who are writing that you are ashamed of yourselves and ashamed of your country. What is it that you're ashamed for? So it's definitely getting someone's attention.
All right, Matt Bodner, we'll be checking in with you. Thank you so much.
Let's bring in NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell in Washington. So, Kelly, let's talk about what's next. Later this morning, President Biden will hold a virtual summit with fellow NATO heads. What's the goal here?
Well, this is a significant development because this will bring together the leaders of the 30 member nations. And this has both a practical and a symbolic importance because after we've just been listening to all that compelling reporting coming from Ukraine, here is an opportunity for the leaders of the defensive organization of NATO to send a message to Vladimir Putin that they are standing together. They are prepared to defend the NATO nations. And that, of course, includes many in the area that will flank Ukraine and Russia, and also looking at how can they help the people of Ukraine. So President Biden will be a part of this conversation with NATO leaders, and this is an emergency summit, if you will, bringing them together virtually. And it's critical that if wars can often be sloppy, they can be unpredictable, they can go in places that people don't intend. We've heard that in some of the reporting already. And there are great concerns about could Vladimir Putin's ambitions go beyond Ukraine? And that would mean potentially into a NATO country. And that changes the dynamic dramatically. Now, we're not saying that that's what's going to happen, but that's a grave concern for NATO members who would have a defensive position. And so we're seeing U.S. military and other NATO countries beefing up their military in the European areas that are along the border here. And we heard from Antony Blinken talking about the concerns that NATO countries have about a common defense. Here's what he had to say.
Well, first, Lester, when it comes to threatening NATO countries, we have something very powerful called Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. Russia knows that, and that's exactly why, among other things, one of our responses has been to shore up NATO's defenses. To put more forces, to put more equipment on its eastern flank, the countries closest to Russia, to deter any aggression that Russia might be contemplating against NATO countries.
So this will be about military support to beef up the NATO countries, but also discussions of support to help Ukraine and likely some support for humanitarian needs and perhaps even discussion of what would happen to refugees as we're seeing Ukrainians being displaced. So we expect some of that to be part of that meeting today. Joe?
So, Kelly, the White House released these staggering sanctions yesterday. So far, nothing has deterred Putin. Talk about these latest sanctions. What does the White House hope they'll accomplish?
Well, this is about punishing Putin and punishing the Russian economy. And by doing that, by attacking Russian banks and prominent Russian figures, oligarchs, elites, and making it harder for them to do business. And some of these new financial sanctions would stop them from doing business in a number of currencies, the dollar, the yen, the euro, doing those sorts of things. Also, limiting access for imports of things like semiconductors, things they would need for their own technology. All of that is intended to punish by strangling the Russian economy, crippling their ability to function economically. These are stepped up sanctions, maybe not as far as they could ultimately go. For example, they didn't sanction Putin personally, although that might be more symbolic than effective. And they didn't go after what's known as the SWIFT system, which is a communication system in the financial markets. But the president says these are the strongest sanctions ever done and that they could be very effective in trying to deter Putin now that he's taken this action and to cause suffering in Russia, which could compel Putin to pull back. That's the hope.
Kelly O'Donnell in Washington. Kelly, thank you.
Let's now bring in NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Leanne Caldwell, who's also in Washington with some more reaction from lawmakers. Leanne, good morning. So last week, a Senate sanctions package to punish Russia didn't end up going anywhere. What kept that package from being passed then? And now that Russia has fully moved into Ukraine, we're seeing a full-scale invasion. Is there anything new in the works right now?
Good morning, Savannah. So the reason sanctions were not able to be passed on Capitol Hill is there were disagreements in part on the timing of the sanctions. Republicans really wanted sanctions pre-invasion. Well, now we know that time has come and gone. But there was another reason why they couldn't reach an agreement as well, and that was because Democrats wanted sanctions on what Kelly just mentioned, the SWIFT international system, which is a verification system for international bank transfers. And Republicans didn't think that that was necessary because you have to have European support in order to go that route. Republicans wanted secondary sanctions. That is sanctions on entities who do business with the people who were primarily sanctioned. Now, those sanctions, so that was stuck in Congress, and it turns out that President Biden yesterday didn't impose either one of those, the secondary sanctions or pulling Russia out of the SWIFT banking system. And so there are still conversations ongoing on Capitol Hill. And so we'll see where they go. But ultimately, the president is able to act unilaterally. And what Congress is just kind of a support system in this situation, Savannah.
Now, Leanne, we know the president has said, of course, he won't send troops to Ukraine. It is not a NATO nation. So outside of sanctions, what other actions can Congress take to punish Russia or help Ukraine? I think a lot of people are thinking, oh, my goodness, they need help. What can be done here?
Yeah, honestly, there's not a whole lot, especially to punish Russia outside of sanctions. As far as helping Ukraine, they could give humanitarian aid or military aid to Ukraine. And that is something that is being widely discussed. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell talked about this yesterday. Let's listen to what he said last night.
Assuming there's a significant insurgency, to support that insurgency with weapons and intelligence and everything that will help them make the Russians pay a severe price for this invasion.
But House lawmakers got an unclassified briefing last night, and in that briefing, Defense Secretary Austin admitted that there's a problem with resupplying Ukrainians with military aid. The fact that Russia controls the airspace, they can't get anything in through airplanes, and the land transfers for that military equipment is becoming increasingly difficult as Russia controls more and more territory in Ukraine. Savannah.
All right, Leanne Caldwell, thank you so much.
Coming up, our breaking news coverage continues as this invasion unfolds in Ukraine.
President Biden now sending thousands of U.S. troops closer but not into Ukraine. What we're learning about those plans next on Morning News Now. Welcome back. Our coverage of the attack on Ukraine continues now. 7,000 more U.S. troops are now headed to Germany. The Pentagon said the deployment is being made to reassure our NATO allies of our commitment to them. NBC News global security reporter Dan DeLuce joins us now. Dan, good morning. So let's talk through this latest troop deployment and what it means in regards to America's involvement in Eastern Europe. And is the U.S. ready to do more to help arm Ukrainian forces fighting the Russian invasion? We know there are no plans to move into Ukraine, but as we have more soldiers over there, more equipment, what does this sort of mean?
Well, these are troops coming from Fort Stewart, from the 3rd Infantry Division, and it's part of this wave we've seen of reinforcements heading to Europe, heading to Eastern Europe, to deter any kind of threat from Russia in those eastern states that border Russia that are part of the NATO alliance. And we've seen thousands of U.S. troops already deployed to the Baltic states, to Poland, and elsewhere. Now, the question now really, though, is what is the U.S. ready to do to help the Ukrainian forces that are under huge pressure right now from a very vast, superior military in Russia? And that's really the question. And I think we're going to be hearing more about that in Washington and Western capitals, how to get more weapons to those Ukrainian troops that are outmatched and outgunned by the Russians. And then, of course, the presence of Russian troops on the ground makes it complicated to get weapons and hardware to the Ukrainians. So I think that will be something we'll be hearing more about today. NATO leaders are meeting today, the heads of state, and they'll probably talk more about bolstering that eastern flank and also figuring out how to help the Ukrainians fighting the Russians as we speak.
So, Dan, as you and I have talked about, and as we talked about yesterday, of course, President Biden is continuing to reiterate yesterday again at his press conference that no American troops will be going into Ukraine. So, I mean, first, the question, is there anything that would change the White House's stance on this involvement? Obviously, that seems far off, given, again, that it's not a NATO country, and involving would escalate things. But is this policy going to be strong enough to deter Russia from moving further? Does anything change if Russian forces even get further west to places like Lviv, never mind even further into Europe?
You know, I think for certain, there is absolutely no consideration of sending U.S. troops into Ukraine to enter into a direct war with Russia. That is not in the cards. That has been ruled out. I think it's really something no one wants to contemplate, given the nuclear arsenals that both of these superpowers possess. And then you ask the key question, is it enough to deter Russia? I think the NATO heads of state, I think the Biden administration believes that the NATO alliance and the presence of troops in those NATO countries is enough to deter Russia, but they want to drive home the message to Putin that the more aggressive actions he takes, the more there will be a NATO troop presence and a military presence in those eastern countries on his border. But there is another risk here, and that is as Russian troops attack Ukraine, launch missiles, launch fighter jets, there's a risk of an accidental clash or collision, an unintended kind of incident. And so that will be another real challenge to going forward as the war widens and expands. There are U.S. troops very near. There are U.S. aircraft very near. And that's going to take some doing to kind of create some kind of hotline between Washington and Moscow.
Absolutely. Dan DeLuce, thank you so much. Your expertise is so appreciated.
For more on this, let's bring in former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, John Herbst. He was ambassador from 2003 to 2006 and is now the senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Ambassador, always good to have you with us. I want to begin by asking you about this increased U.S. troop movement President Biden ordered yesterday into Europe. Again, no plans to send U.S. forces directly into Ukraine. But what do you think of this administration's response to the attack so far? Are we doing everything we can, or would you like to see more?
Okay. First, the U.S. troop movement to NATO's east is very important because we have to make it clear to Mr. Putin that if he were to do anything there, he will face, in fact, the might of not just the NATO forces, but the U.S. forces. And he does understand that our conventional military, while we are disadvantaged in the Baltic states, for example, is much more powerful than his. But regarding our response, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Please continue.
I was going to now turn to Ukraine. All right. Regarding our response to the 2-day-old Russian direct attack on Ukraine, frankly, we see a failure of imagination, a failure of statesmanship here. The sanctions that President Biden announced yesterday were, on their own face, a positive step. But with Moscow launching missile attacks on Ukraine's capital and 23 others or 24 other Ukrainian cities, he shouldn't have sounded like an accountant. He should have sounded like a statesman. And we needed to address the two big steps we could have taken in the financial area, which we did not. One is SWIFT. The other would be sanctioning Russia's central bank. The Ukrainians are fighting for their lives. They need to understand that while the U.S. will not send troops, we will send everything else we can to help them. And we should have gone after either the central bank or SWIFT yesterday. A weakness in Biden policy in this crisis is deferring to the most timid European allies. Alliance management means not just taking into account the concerns of our allies, but pushing them in the right direction. And we don't see enough of that type of leadership from this White House.
Let's talk about Ukrainian President Zelensky. He said yesterday the enemy has marked him as the #1 target. I mean, what is it going to mean if Russia captures the Ukrainian capital and potentially the president? What happens from there?
Well, I think that Zelensky and his team have plans for continuation of governance. So under Ukrainian law, if somehow the president is incapacitated, you have someone else who takes over. So I think that will play out in an appropriate way or a good way for Ukraine. But also, Russian forces are starting to approach the capital. The big question is, are they going to be willing to go into the city? Because if they do, a lot of the Russian soldiers are going to die, and so will a lot of Ukrainian civilians.
All right, Ambassador Herbst, as always, we thank you for joining us and appreciate your analysis.
My pleasure.
Of course, we're going to keep you updated on developments in Ukraine throughout the hour, but we're also following other major stories here at home.
Coming up here in Morning News now, guilty verdicts for 3 former police officers who were on the scene when George Floyd was killed. We're going to take you to Minnesota for more on that decision, plus reaction.
Welcome back. If you're just waking up or just joining us, a lot has happened overnight as the Russian military advances farther into Ukraine.
Let's get you caught up on the very latest. Last night, a top Pentagon official told lawmakers in the U.S. that Russian forces were about 20 miles from the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. In a video message around 6:40 Eastern time last night, Ukrainian President Zelenskyy said 137 soldiers had been killed, more than 300 others injured in the fight.
Then around 12:23 this morning, an apartment building was hit by debris after an aircraft was reportedly shot down in Kyiv. You can see the burned outside of the building there.
2 hours later, the Ukrainian Interior Ministry said that Ukrainian forces were blowing up bridges to try and slow down Russian forces advancing on the capital.
And just before 3 this morning, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense issued this message asking citizens to make and use Molotov cocktails against the Russian military.
And shortly after 4 a.m., a warning from Ukraine that Russian forces are using disguises to enter the country. NBC News has not been able to verify these reports. And also this morning, NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley reported a massive bombardment in central Kharkiv. Matt said it was so close he could hear car alarms going off. And citing Russia's defense ministry, the news agency TASS is reporting that Russian military has blocked Kyiv from the west. That's reporting we have not yet been able to independently verify. We're going to continue to follow the latest developments out of Ukraine this morning, but there is some other news we do want to get to quickly.
Yeah, the 3 former police officers who were on the scene when George Floyd was killed have been found guilty on federal charges. J. Alexander King, Thomas Lane, and Tu Tao were convicted of violating Floyd's civil rights when they failed to give him medical aid. King and Tao were also convicted of not intervening to stop their former fellow officer Derek Chauvin from using excessive force when he killed Floyd. Chauvin was convicted of murder and manslaughter charges at the state level last year. NBC News correspondent SHAQUILLE Brewster has been following this case for us from the beginning and joins us live from St. Paul, Minnesota. Shaq, good morning. So what was it like in the courtroom when this verdict came down? And what do we know about what the officers' sentences could look like and when we'll hear about that?
Good morning. Yeah, there was minimal reaction in the courtroom as the judge read that verdict. Those 3 guilty charges, or 5 guilty charges for the 3 defendants. Thomas Lane, one of the defendants who received 1 guilty charge, he apparently shrugged and shook his head as that verdict was read and looked over at his attorney. Notably, 2 of the jurors, according to poll reporters, became visibly emotional as they were individually polled and confirmed that guilty verdict. This was a jury of 8 women and 4 men, apparently all white, although the court hasn't released that information directly. That took about 13 hours over the course of 2 days to reach that decision. They were dealing with a lot of text here, a lot of serious charges, and they eventually reached that unanimous verdict after that 13 hours of deliberation.
How's Floyd's family reacting, Shaq, to this verdict, and what do they ultimately hope comes out of it?
Well, we heard from the brother of George Floyd, who we know family members were in the courtroom throughout the trial, and he spoke after the verdict with some federal prosecutors. I want you to listen to what we heard from PHILONISE Floyd, again, the brother of George Floyd.
It can never be justice because I can never get George back. And no matter how many times that I pray at night and I think about my brother 24/7, it still is going to be hard, even though we just had a federal conviction and we already had the state conviction. But times, you know, will be probably a lot harder for me still because I can't get my brother back.
We also heard from the federal prosecutors in that same press conference. They were emphasizing the idea that they hope this sends a message to other members of law enforcement that sometimes the inaction can be just as important as an action.
Wow. And Shaq, while these 3 men await sentencing, they're also going to be back in a courtroom later this year. That's on state charges. What kind of charges are they facing at the state level? What's the difference here?
That's right. We're likely to see them back in a courtroom in June, so just a couple of months. They're facing those original charges of aiding and abetting the murder and manslaughter of George Floyd. We'll expect to see that happen in the state court. The difference between that trial and what we saw with this trial is this trial focused on their inactions. The prosecutors saying that they did not act, and their willful decision not to act was a violation of George Floyd's rights. In the state trial, it will be about the actions they took as George Floyd was dying under the knee of Derek Chauvin.
All right, Shaquille Brewster in Minnesota for us. Thank you so much.
You got it.
This busy news morning, we do want to get a check on your morning news now weather.
Yeah, especially because a massive winter storm is going to dump snow and ice from Texas to Maine. Bill Cairns joins us with the latest forecast. Hi, Bill. It's very good to see you. Good morning.
Hey, guys. Good morning. Great to see you. So as we head into the weekend, things will get quieter, but this ice storm has been problematic. I mean, hundreds, if not thousands, of car wrecks. Yesterday, the worst of it was in Oklahoma, Arkansas, and in Texas. And, you know, I've seen jackknife tractor trailers a million times. Not often they catch fire when they jackknife in icy conditions, but that happened yesterday on I-40. That shut down the highway there south of Oklahoma City for a while. No one was injured, but, you know, not fun putting out a fire with wind chills in the single digits either. And to talk about wrecks, from Dallas all the way to Austin, they had a coating of freezing rain, and it was enough to cause a lot of problems on all the roads there in that region. So what are we left with this morning? We still have 65 million people under winter weather advisories or winter storm warnings. The Ohio Valley and especially areas of the Northeast are most at risk. It's a really slippery morning out there across Pennsylvania. We had a lot of freezing rain overnight. There's a coating of freezing rain just outside of New York City into southern New England, and then just a snowstorm for you in areas of central and northern New England. As far as the heavy snow goes, the worst of it now, northern Connecticut, Massachusetts, from Albany northwards heading into Vermont and New Hampshire, that's where the worst of the snow is. But the ice is really from Pennsylvania right through just about New York City this morning. So additional snowfall. Skiers are loving it heading into this upcoming weekend. Another 6 to 12 possible in northern portions of Vermont and New Hampshire. We're just about done with the accumulating snows, Hartford, Albany, and Boston. The ice, we're still seeing freezing rain out there, especially, guys, just outside of New York City. The worst of that will be from New York northward. So, again, a very slippery day, but it improves as we head through this afternoon, this evening.
All right. And the skiers will enjoy a nice ski weekend then.
Look at
The
that.
bright side.
Yeah, they will.
Thanks, Bill. And coming up, we'll have the latest developments on the Russian attack on Ukraine this morning, including whiplash on Wall Street as investors react to the war there. We'll bring you the latest on the stock market and the possible impacts of those U.S. sanctions on Russia.
Plus, President Biden weighing options for cyber attacks against Russia. What we're learning next on Morning News Now.
Welcome back. This morning, President Biden is looking at options for the U.S. to carry out a massive cyber attack against Russia. Ukraine's government and banking websites have already been the target of Russian cyber attacks this week. NBC News national security correspondent Ken DeLanian joins us now. Hey, Ken, good morning. So let's talk through what are the options on the table right now for President Biden? Is this something we're really considering?
Good morning, Savannah. Whether he's really considering it is the big question, but multiple U.S. officials and others briefed on the matter told Courtney Kube and me that a menu of options from pretty mild to fairly severe to cyber attack Russia in retaliation for the invasion and as a way of slowing down Russia's ability to conduct this invasion have been presented to the president. And this would be the most significant use of American offensive cyber in history. The United States has been very judicious in how it has used its cyber weapons. Often they are used in a very targeted fashion, often for information ops. What we're talking about here are things like making trains go off the tracks so that they can't resupply Russian troops, potentially shutting down the internet, attacks on Russian critical infrastructure. Now, our sources told us that the U.S. would fully expect that the Russians would retaliate and conduct cyber attacks here, potentially things like what happened with Colonial Pipeline, where it made it difficult for Americans to get gas. And so some people in the Biden administration view this as unacceptably escalatory and risky. And again, it's, no final decision has been made. And the White House actually pushed back on our story, although they didn't say what exactly they thought was wrong with it. Multiple officials have assured us that these options are being considered. And again, it remains a question what President Biden will do in the end.
So I want to ask you, let's talk a little bit more about retaliation. One of the things that was just on that graphic our viewers might have noticed also was shutting off electric power, which reminds me of a report earlier this week from our colleague Tom Costello talking about, we could shut off the lights in St. Petersburg, but then they could just do the same here. I mean, what does this become if cyber warfare were to be used? You point out this would be the biggest in our history. I mean, what does that look like if there is this capability on the other side? What does retaliation mean? A back and forth?
Well, it could look very bad. And in fact, one of our sources said, whatever we can do to them, they can do to us. And that's essentially the problem here. And so the options, most of the options presented to the president are designed to disrupt but not destroy, to fall just short of an act of war. It's carefully calibrated here. And the Russians know that, too, that if they conduct a cyber attack in the United States that kills people, that's an act of war. That's really escalatory between two nuclear powers. So both sides are trying to calibrate, but you're absolutely right in pointing out that this could easily spiral out of control, and that may be an argument against doing it, Savannah.
And Ken, quickly, just put this in context for us. You mentioned it would be the first time in our history to do something of this scale. I mean, what does this really mean to use a cyber weapon potentially on that scale and kind of moving forward how we would be able to handle Russia?
Yeah, well, first of all, it really shows how this technology has evolved. And what some of the people who are involved in the planning told me is the interesting thing about cyber weapons is that you can really calibrate the impact. A 500-pound bomb does the same damage. You can select a target, but the bomb is going to do what the bomb is going to do. In cyber, you can do a lot of different things, and short of hurting people or destroying things, and that's a good option, but it's also very dangerous because sometimes the malware used in cyber attacks spirals out of control, goes places where the authors of it didn't want it to go. We've seen that with Russia and the NotPetya attack, which caused billions and billions of dollars in damage around the world. So this comes with promise and peril, this technology, Savannah.
Wow, very important context for us. Thank you so much, Ken.
The attack on Ukraine is, of course, having a huge impact on the world's economy.
Yeah, Rahel Salman joins us now with how the markets are reacting to the situation in Ukraine. Good morning, Rahel.
Joe and Savannah, good morning to you. Wall Street is set to open lower. Dow futures are off right now about 150 points. But this follows a stunning comeback for the markets yesterday. Investors, of course, continue to assess the impact from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Yesterday, the Dow closed up about 90 points after it had been down nearly 860 points at the lows of the day. The S&P 500 ended up 1.5% after being down more than 2.5%. And the Nasdaq rallied from a decline of nearly 3.5% to end up more than 3%. Oil prices also settled well off their highs. Brent crude, which is the global benchmark, settled around $99 a barrel after topping 105. U.S. crude, meantime, settled around $93 a barrel. We should say, though, that oil is pulling back this morning, reversing earlier gains on concerns over potential supply disruptions. Now, when you think about the reversal we saw yesterday, traders point to a few reasons for why, saying essentially U.S. and European sanctions did not target Russia's oil and gas industry or freeze Russia out of a key global payment system. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are surging after a deep sell-off yesterday, although, guys, they still do remain well off the all-time highs set back in November.
All right, Rahel, thank you so much.
All right, we're watching this invasion play out in real time, not just on TV, but also on social media, including TikTok. Live streams on the app are giving the world a first-person view of the situation in Ukraine. While some of them appear to be authentic, others are actually fake. NBC News senior reporter Ben Collins has been looking into these posts, joins us now. So, Ben, it's been more than 24 hours since the invasion began. What are you seeing play out on TikTok?
Well, we're seeing a mix of very real footage from Ukraine and a mix of things that simply aren't from Ukraine. We're seeing the tops of buildings in the UK with sirens and gunshots over them. And why would someone do that? Well, they can collect donations. They can get money this way. That's what's happening right now on TikTok, is a lot of scamming, a lot of spam in this space. In fact, there's one video of a Russian soldier who's, parachuting onto what appears to be what they claim is Ukraine. Really, the video was taken 4 years ago from 2016. So a lot of reappropriated war footage, a lot of reappropriated military exercises that are being used on TikTok and presented as part of now.
Let's talk about another extreme example. One of the videos you found viewed nearly 20 million times. The user passed it off as coming from Ukraine. Turns out he was actually live streaming from his couch. Tell us more about what happened here. Where did the video actually come from?
Yeah, that was from a military training exercise in Russia from 2016. That was, when you click through, you could see very quickly this guy was on his couch. He had posted this on his Instagram, as you can see there, in April of 2016, before he posted it a couple of hours after the invasion started to happen. But without context on TikTok, people assumed that this was part of the invasion. And what you see is people sanitizing this, saying this feels like, this feels like Minecraft. This feels like a video game. Well, it's not Minecraft. It's not a video game. This is what war is. And it doesn't look like a guy very happily jumping out from the sky.
So for those of us who are watching this, if you see a video on social media supposedly from Ukraine, how can you figure out if it's real? What's the sort of news literacy advice as to how to approach this?
Sure, just check into the account. A lot of these accounts started yesterday or 2 days beforehand, and they started posting just videos of them rummaging through stuff as sirens blare in the background. You don't know where that stuff is. That stuff could be in Ukraine. And if they're asking for donations or money, just keep a keen eye out for that. That's a good tip, that they may not specifically be working in good faith here.
Reminder that anytime we have these major stories like this, scam artists are out there to take advantage of the situation. Ben, thanks so much for your reporting. We appreciate it. Coming up, dozens of Americans fleeing Ukraine as this invasion unfolds.
Yeah, up next, how one nonprofit is working to help people get out. Next on Morning News Now.
The crisis unfolding overseas in Ukraine is striking a nerve with many Americans here at home. People are taking to the streets in support of Ukraine.
And many of them are still desperate to hear from their loved ones now living in a war zone. Here's NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber.
A striking show of support for Ukraine from coast to coast. In New York City, protesters draping the heart of Times Square in blue and yellow, waving a massive Ukrainian flag. Voicing their objections to Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Russia, go home! Russia, go home!
And urging all Americans to pay attention.
I'm scared by the world response.
Alex bringing his young son, Christina there with her family too.
It's heartbreaking to see that the world is watching what is unfolding, an illegal war, the attack on a sovereign nation.
Pro-Ukrainian protest bubbling up in all corners of the country, from Los Angeles.
The whole world will never forget this.
To Washington, D.C.
Biden stand with Ukraine.
To Austin, Texas.
Ukraine is free. Ukraine is free.
To Chicago. Our Jesse Kirsch there on the ground.
Hundreds gathering in the city's Ukrainian village neighborhood, calling for U.S. support to end a war, denouncing Vladimir Putin.
In New York, what started in Times Square spread.
Stop the war! Stop the war!
Outside the Russian consulate, a small but emotional gathering. But no matter the size of the group, the message was the same. Ukraine is more than its borders.
We have been a people way before Moscow were a people. We have churches, we have culture, we have over a thousand-year history. Get out of Ukraine.
I still have childhood friends that live in the village near Poltava. They are young professionals like me. Up until yesterday, they were going to work. I have a pregnant friend in Poltava who can't go to the hospital right now to check up on her baby.
And for so many of them, every missile, every gunshot hits home.
We were on the phone actually with my grandma, but they went in an underground bunker. But once they heard the boom, the internet service completely cut out, and that was the last we heard from them from now. We still haven't heard from them again, but we're really hoping for the best, and it's honestly just a terrible time.
Our thanks to Ellison Barber for that report. That does it for this hour of Morning News Now.
But the news continues right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.